Text of study given by V.T. Houteff, Sabbath, October 5, 1946, Mount Carmel Center, Waco, Texas. I shall read the first two paragraphs of page 159 of Mount of Blessings. Quote, God is our Father, who loves and cares for us as His children. He is also the great King of the universe. The interests of His kingdom are our interests, and we are to work for its upbuilding. The disciples of Christ were looking for the immediate coming of the kingdom of glory. But in giving them this prayer, Jesus taught that the kingdom was not then to be established. They were to pray for its coming as an event yet future. But this petition was also an assurance to them. While they were not to hold the coming of the kingdom in their day, the fact that Jesus bade them pray for it is evidence that in God's own time it will surely come. End quote. From this reading, we see that praying alone is not sufficient to bring in the kingdom. It requires of us work too. Now, what shall we pray for? We shall pray for a realization that prayer alone will not take us into the kingdom. That work is needful, as is prayer. Who will volunteer to pray? Our subject this afternoon is the house of David as the angel of the Lord before them. We shall turn to Zechariah, the 12th chapter. The text of the subject is found in the 8th verse, but in order to find the time and the people to which this verse applies, we must begin our study with the first verse. Zechariah 12, verse 1. The burden of the word of the Lord for Israel, saith the Lord, which stretcheth forth the heavens, and layeth the foundation of the earth, and formeth the spirit of man from within. The burden here is the Lord's, and He is addressing Israel, the church, not the world. Now, verse 2. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about, when they shall be in the siege both against Judah and against Jerusalem. From this verse we learn that there is to be a siege not only against Jerusalem, but against Judah also, against the entire kingdom, the church or people. And at that time, at the time of the siege, Jerusalem will be made a cup of trembling to all people. Verse 3. And in that day will I make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it. This siege will not be made by the nations surrounding Jerusalem alone, but by all the people of the earth. And Jerusalem will then be a burdensome stone to all the people round about. They will hate Judah and Jerusalem, and as a result they will besiege the city. They shall nevertheless be cut in pieces. Verse 4. In that day, saith the Lord, I will smite every horse with astonishment, and his rider with madness, and I will open mine eyes upon the house of Judah, and will smite every horse of the people with blindness. The Lord will smite with madness and astonishment and blindness those who besiege the city, but He will open His eyes upon the house of Judah. Verse 5. And the governors of Judah shall say in their heart, the inhabitants of Jerusalem shall be my strength in the Lord of hosts their God. When the governors of Judah realize that their strength depends upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the Lord their God, then it is that they shall indeed be strong. Let us see what verse 6 says. Verse 6. In that day will I make the governors of Judah like an hearth of fire among the wood, and like a torch of fire in a sheaf, and they shall devour all the people round about, on the right hand and on the left, and Jerusalem shall be inhabited again in her own place, even in Jerusalem. It matters not what we think. God is to have a strong, faithful people, the very kind here described, and Jerusalem is again to be inhabited. The promise of Jerusalem is to them. It is not to the Jews. It is not to the Arabs. Verse 7. The Lord also shall save the tents of Judah first, that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem do not magnify themselves against Judah. Now, what shall God do first? He shall save the tents of Judah. The tents, of course, are the dwellings of the common people. He shall save them first. For what reason? That he may humble the more prominent ones, those who lead his people, that they may not exalt themselves above the tents of Judah, and that all may learn to give glory to God, not to any man. Since nothing like what these verses predict has ever happened to God's people in Jerusalem or in any other part of the world, obviously these predictions are yet to meet their fulfillment. And now we are to find out if this promise is to be fulfilled in our time or later on. Since we know that the work we are now doing is not sponsored by any man, that God has led us all the way as definitely as he has led the Exodus movement, that we are making our way inch by inch as providence directs, and as since we are the only people who have the message of the re-inhabiting and setting up of the kingdom in the promised land, and are therefore named Davidians, there is no escaping the conclusion that the time for the fulfillment of these verses is even at the door, and that we are the people to whom these lessons are directed. Plainly then, whatever the Lord has to say in this chapter is for our learning and for our own special needs. It is a communication addressed and unsealed to us now, so that we may know God's will and his ways at this particular time, and what he would have us to do. We are now to read the text of our study. Verse 8. In that day shall the Lord defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and he that is feeble among them at that day shall be as David, and the house of David shall be as God, as the angel of the Lord before them. Besides giving us the assurance that he will defend us, inspiration likens us unto David and unto God. Even the feeble ones shall be as David, and the house of David shall be as God, as the angel of the Lord before them. What a great, great statement! What a privilege to be likened unto God himself! Now, in order for one to know what it means to be as David, one must know what kind of person ancient David was. To begin with, he was a first-rate shepherd, because he even risked his own life for the sheep. You remember that he courageously went after the lion and the bear and killed them in order to save the lambs. Then, to save his nation's independence and God's great honor, he again risked his life when he bravely faced the giant Goliath. Because of David's faithfulness, God delivered him from the beasts and the giant, and made him king over his people. The faithfulness of a person in little things indicates his faithfulness also in greater things. The faithfulness always brings promotion. So, in order to be as David, we must be as faithful, as dependable, and as zealous for God's kingdom as was David. Now, that we might know what it means to be as God, we must study what God is like. To begin with, He not only created and filled the earth with every good thing for His creatures, but He also planted a garden for the man. Thus He made a sample home for all human beings who were to live thereafter. He taught Adam how to keep the home and how to dress the garden. He taught him how to speak, and God endowed him with all the knowledge that life requires one to know in order to be happy. And even after the holy pair fell in sin, He was still as interested in them as He was before. So He then began to teach them how to redeem themselves. From that day to this, He thus continued to teach the human family. To do this, God sent prophets, and He sent angels, even though Adam's descendants did not respect or appreciate them. Then He sent His only begotten Son, and although they even slew Christ, yet God's interest in the human race has continued on to this very generation. Yes, notwithstanding all our faults, He has promised even to take us into His kingdom to live with Him, if we will but believe. He has done and still is doing all these things for us without expecting a cent in return. That is what God is like. And if we are to be as God, then that is what we too must be like. That means that we must be as interested in the upbuilding of His kingdom as He is interested in us. We must be as unselfish as He is. We must gladly teach others all that He has taught us. We must do all we can to improve the living conditions of others. Whatever good thing we may have, whether it be trade or something else that is worth having, we must be as desirous of teaching it to others, if they are interested enough to apply themselves in learning it, as He was desirous of teaching us. If we neglect this duty, we shall not only fail to be as God, but shall even be required to give an account of our neglect. All through my life I have found people who are very selfish, fearful that someone would get ahead of them in business or exceed them in their standard of living. When I was learning my trade, I often found it necessary to ask questions, and some with whom I was working refused to answer my questions. Their selfishness, however, did not stop me from learning what I wanted to know. I learned it in some other way. These men, however, did not profess to be as far advanced in Christian living as we profess to be, and for this reason their selfishness can be charged to human ignorance. But we should try to give our knowledge to as many as we can and expect nothing in return. Yet God Himself will reward us. But if we try to keep our knowledge to ourselves, we most assuredly shall be the losers. Remember, too, that all the knowledge which we possess is a gift to us from God. Now what will you do with it? The Lord taught the birds how to build their nests and how to raise their young. Then should we not teach others how to build and better their homes and their living? You recall that Jesus said, "Whosoever shall give to drink unto one of these little ones a cup of cold water, only in the name of a disciple, verily I say unto you, he shall in no wise lose his reward." Matthew 10, verse 42. If God were not what He is, He would not be God. And if we continue as we now are, we shall never be as God. The house of David, moreover, is to be as the angel of the Lord before them. What does this mean? It means that if we are to be members of the house of David, we must be like the angels. The angels excel in strength. They obey God's commands. They hearken unto the voice of His word. Psalm 103, verse 20. They are always at hand to minister to the saints, and they have led the saints safely through all their conflicts throughout the ages. God expects His church and people to be just that, as the angel of the Lord, and the church will be, regardless what we choose to be. Now, what is the overall purpose of the house of David? Our answer is found in our types, in the duties of those who have gone before us, and whose work inspiration points out was for our ensample. The house of David, the scriptures reveal, is being built up for a threefold purpose. 1. To build the old wastes, to raise the former desolations, and to repair the waste cities, the desolations of many generations. Isaiah 61 verse 4. This work has as its type the returning of the ancient Jews from their Babylonian captivity to the promised land. Just as they were to build the wastes, the former desolations, the temple of the Lord, the city and the walls, and to reestablish the worship of God according to the Lord's own divine desire, so we too are called to the same work. We must therefore labor as they labored. The remnant which were left in Babylon, according to Nehemiah chapter 1 verse 3, and against whom a decree went forth that they should be slain, as revealed in Esther 3, 8 through 15, typify the remnant of the woman's seed against which the dragon is to make war. Revelation 12 verse 17. 2. In addition to that great and grand work, we are to break the yoke of the Gentiles, to emancipate the people of God from Gentile rule, from Assyria and from Egypt and from Pathros and from Cush and from Elam and from Shinar and from Hamath and from the islands of the sea. We are to set up an ensign, the antitypical kingdom, for the nations, and to assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Isaiah 11 verse 12. We are to make a highway for the remnant of His people which shall be left from Assyria, like as it was to Israel in the day that he came up out of the land of Egypt. Isaiah 11 verse 16. Our work has as its type the Exodus movement going out of Egypt and establishing itself in the promised land. As they were freed from their Egyptian bondage, so shall we be freed from the bondage of the Gentiles. And as they possessed the land and set up the kingdom, so shall we, if we make their mistakes our stepping stones. 3. Finally, we are to hasten the coming of the day of God, wherein the heavens, being on fire, shall be dissolved, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. We are to bring new heavens and a new earth, wherein dwelleth righteousness. 2 Peter 3, 12 and 13. For a partial type of this work, we have the flood. As Noah's preaching brought the world to an end in his day, so our preaching will bring the world to an end in our day. The work of these three movements, therefore, is our work. Whatever their experiences were, ours are to be similar. Now we clearly see that God's work does not consist of preaching alone, but of manual work too. There are thousands in the world who are as anxious to preach as are the bears to fill up their stomachs after coming out of the winter's hibernation. What the world needs today, though, is not more persons who are zealous in nothing other than preaching, but rather persons who are just as willing and anxious to build the wastes, the temple, the city, and the walls, as they are willing and anxious to preach. Nor is the world in need of men who are angling for Aaron's priestly office, but it is in dire need of men who will dare to face the giants in the land. What we need today are Noah's, Moses's, Ezra's, Nehemiah's, and a great number of Jobs. We must be like those men if we are ever to be welcome into the house of David. Our work and duty are now made as clear as they can be made at this particular time. We need not err. We need not be ignorant of what we must be and of what we must do. Many honestly think that they are doing God's work, or that they are helping in it, at least. But if they would examine their daily accomplishments, their motives, their purposes, many will find that they are not working for God, but they are working for themselves. Self is their primary consideration. Actually, now as in Moses' time, there are occasions when one is at a loss to know whether saints or devils are busily engaged in God's great work. Ezra and Nehemiah had an arduous time building the temple. I believe that God could have given them angels to surround the city and thus keep away their enemies who were interfering with the project. The faithful, though, did the work of building by holding the sword in one hand and the bricks in the other hand. Their work was as hard, if not harder than ours is, but they were faithful at it, and we cannot afford to be otherwise. Yes, they did more working than they did preaching, and they taught not only religion, but building too. Do you not see that of all the things which we are called to do, none can be done by preaching alone? No, no more than the work of our types could have been done by preaching alone. We are now ready to read verses 9 and 10. And it shall come to pass in that day that I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem, and I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him, as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him, as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn. When God pours upon his saints the spirit of grace, then will they mourn and enjoy mourning too, because they will not mourn for self as most people do now. It is because men do not now have the spirit of grace that their personal feelings so easily get injured. And since the spirit of grace causes us to mourn for others rather than for ourselves, it is understandable that when we pity ourselves and when we get hurt for what others do or say against us, we get hurt only because we are imbued with the spirit of the devil, who is daily seeking to crush and to ruin us. Remember that self-pity is outright self-defeat. Not one of us has ever been abused as was the Lord, and yet his self never was injured. If we are to be sorry for anyone, let us be sorry for others. We sometimes think we are sorry for our sinning and causing the Lord to be abused and crucified, but our sorrow is not real. It is only theoretical. When the Spirit of grace is poured upon us, then we shall really mourn. Then we shall fully realize that it was not the Jews, but the sins of all of us that crucified Christ. Then we shall doubtless wish that we had been abused, that we had suffered for his sake. Verses 11 to 14. In that day shall there be a great mourning in Jerusalem, as the mourning of Hadad Rimmon in the valley of Megiddon. In the land shall mourn, every family apart, the family of the house of David apart, and their wives apart, the family of the house of Nathan apart, and their wives apart, the family of the house of Levi apart, and their wives apart, the family of Shimei apart, and their wives apart, all the families that remain, every family apart, and their wives apart. A great day is coming, brother, sister, and if it were not at hand, we would not today have this light on our pathway. Let us therefore work to build up the Lord's kingdom, that His will be done in us, and thus, at long last, be done on earth as it is done in heaven. Let us now, as forerunners of His kingdom, prove ourselves worthy to stand with Him on Mount Zion, and as to be as God, as the angel of the Lord, before the saints, and to carry the everlasting gospel to all the nations, and thus bring the world's sins and woes to an end.